chill of early spring clung to the small village of St. Hathercombe, mist rising from the damp hedgerows that lined its winding lanes. The quiet was broken only by the echo of boots striking stone as Sergeant Bailey of the County Constabulary hurried up the gravel drive of Whitmore Manor. The old estate, though still dignified in its Georgian symmetry, had begun to show its years, ivy choking one wing, slates missing from the roof, and shutters sagging where the wood had long since surrendered to rot. Yet even in its decline, Whitmore Manor remained a place of whispered reverence, for it belonged to Colonel Arthur Whitmore, once decorated for valour in the Great War, and later remembered for his peculiar austerity of character. Now, though, the estate was no longer simply a decaying monument to his past. It was a crime scene. Bailey paused at the manor's threshold, tugging at his collar. Inside in the library, the colonel's body had been found only an hour before. The call had come from the household staff, frantic and bewildered, and already the incident had stirred a ripple of gossip through the village. With a sigh, Bailey steeled himself and entered. The library smelled of cold ash and old tobacco. Dark oak shelves groaned with books whose spines were coated in dust, though the desk at the far end gleamed with an almost unnatural polish. Colonel Whitmore lay slumped beside it, his once commanding frame awkwardly folded against the carpet. His eyes were wide open, staring at the elaborate plaster ceiling above, and his lips were pulled into a faint grimace. The doctor had already attended and muttered of suspicious causes. What unsettled Bailey most, however, was not the death itself, but the strangeness surrounding it. There was no sign of forced entry. The windows had been latched from within, the heavy curtains drawn across them. The door had been locked, or so claimed the butler, Mr. Sims, who swore he had to fetch the spare key from the kitchen wall before anyone could enter. No footprints were visible in the thick rug, no broken glass, no overturned chair. Whitmore's revolver, still in its case, lay untouched on a shelf. The colonel had been very much alive the previous evening, when by all accounts he retired after dinner in his usual silence. The only item out of place, if it could be called that, was a small scrap of cloth clutched in Whitmore's hand. Bailey leaned close, frowning. It was a torn corner of white linen, faintly perfumed, the hem stitched with a delicate cross in pale blue thread. It looked, unmistakably, like a piece of a nun's habit. Yet there were no convents in St. Hathercombe, none for 20 miles. Miss Jane Marple, who happened to be staying with an old friend in the village, learned of the matter not from the constabulary but from the excited whispers that spread through the morning market. She was buying apples when she overheard two women discussing the colonel's sudden death. One insisted it must have been his heart. After all, hadn't the man been under strain? The other, more conspiratorial, spoke of locked doors and secret enemies. Miss Marple, quiet as ever, asked only a few gentle questions, and by the time she returned to her friend's cottage, she knew enough to understand that something unusual was afoot. By midday, her presence was requested at the manor. Bailey, though sceptical, had encountered her insight before and recognized the calm authority with which she saw what others did not. When she entered the library, she paused not at the body but at the desk, tilting her head as though listening to some faint echo. "Colonel Whitmore," she murmured softly, "was not a man much given to carelessness, was he?" "No, ma'am," Bailey admitted. "Strict sort. Ran this house like a barracks." "Then we must ask," she continued, leaning ever so slightly on her parasol, "how something so delicate, so utterly out of place, came to be in his hand." Her eyes rested on the scrap of cloth. Bailey explained again what little they knew, the locked room, the absence of intrusion, the odd token clutched by the dead man. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her gaze lingering on the windows, the bookshelves, the writing desk with its neat rows of correspondence. Finally, she turned to Bailey. "A locked door is only as impenetrable as one imagines it to be," she said, "and a clue as peculiar as this piece of linen is meant, I suspect, not to enlighten but to mislead. The question is not why a nun might have been here, but why someone wished us to think she had." Her words, quiet though they were, seemed to settle like mist in the air, deepening the sense of unease. For the colonel, stern, upright, and deeply private, had few known visitors, and none of them women of the cloth. Yet the presence of that scrap, delicate and scented, was undeniable. It was both too conspicuous and too implausible. And as Miss Marple's sharp eyes traced the orderly patterns of the room, she knew instinctively that this crime, whether murder or something subtler, had been staged with extraordinary care. The baffling question remained. What truth was hidden beneath the veil of such an impossible scene? And with that, the mystery of Colonel Whitmore's nun's betrayal began. Miss Marple did not hurry her observations. To Sergeant Bailey's eyes, the room was barren of evidence, but to hers every surface breathed with some whisper of character. She glanced at the Colonel's desk, noting the immaculate alignment of his pens, the squared stack of envelopes, the blotting pad positioned with military precision. Such order spoke of habit, discipline, and a mind unwilling to tolerate even small disorder. Yet one item broke the pattern. A letter opener not returned to its stand lay crookedly beside an inkwell. It was no more than an inch astray, but in a room so exact the irregularity was a shout. "Odd," she murmured, bending closer. The Colonel was not one to leave things awry. Even in death he clutches something carefully chosen. One might almost think his hand was guided. Bailey frowned, uncertain whether she meant by his own will or another's hand. Before he could ask, a door creaked and Mr. Sims, the butler, entered. He carried a tray of tea, his hand steady despite the tension in the room. Miss Marple observed him closely. His posture was too controlled, too deliberate, as if he had rehearsed each gesture. When he set the tray down, his eyes lingered on the scrap of linen in the inspector's evidence pouch, and for the briefest second his lips pressed thin. "Thank you, Sims," Miss Marple said kindly. "You must have been most distressed. You knew the Colonel better than anyone." The butler bowed his head slightly. "I served him 30 years, madam. He was not easy to please, but one grew accustomed." Her gaze did not leave his face. "Then I imagine you were surprised to see his door locked this morning?" "Yes, madam. Surprised indeed. The Colonel never locked himself in. He demanded to be available at all times." She sipped her tea delicately, letting the silence press. The man shifted his weight ever so slightly. To Miss Marple, the movement was telling. Later, when Bailey led her through the rest of the household, 2 maids, a cook, and the Colonel's distant nephew, Mr. Edmund Whitmore, she observed each with the same quiet intensity. The maids were pale, frightened girls, one of whom cried freely while the other bit her lip to keep from doing so. The cook wrung her apron and whispered of how the Colonel always disliked spices in his soup, as though that somehow explained his death. But Edmund, young and sharp-eyed, was altogether different. He stood with hands thrust in his pockets, leaning against the banister with an air of suppressed irritation. "A pity," he muttered, though hardly unexpected. My uncle's temper was a sword forever at his own throat. Miss Marple regarded him gently. "You were fond of him, then?" Edmund gave a short laugh. "Fond? That is not the word I'd choose. He tolerated me here only because I am his heir, and he liked to remind me that his fortune might yet be willed elsewhere. He relished control, Miss Marple. Perhaps death is the only thing that has relieved him of it." His bitterness rang sharp in the air, but Miss Marple's eyes strayed to his shoes. A fine pair of brogues, yes, but faintly dusted with soil, not from the gravel paths outside, but of a darker hue, like earth from the garden beds. It seemed careless for a man who otherwise kept his attire so neat. She filed the observation away without remark. When she returned to the library, Bailey was sketching the room for the report. He looked up, his pencil hovering. "What do you make of it, ma'am? A locked room, no weapon, no mark of violence. It's like he just stopped." Miss Marple lowered herself into an armchair and folded her hands. "Appearances are deceptive, Sergeant. A crime that looks impossible is often staged to look precisely that way. It creates confusion, discourages questions, yet the details betray more than the design. Consider the linen scrap, conspicuous, almost theatrical. Consider also that faint scent upon it, violets. A nun's habit does not carry perfume. Someone wished us to see one thing and smell another." Bailey blinked. "So it's a plant? You mean someone put it there?" "I should think so." She glanced at the Colonel's stiff hand. "And note the position. A dying man clutching a token clings tight, fingers curled. Yet here the cloth is trapped but loosely. It suggests it was pressed into his hand after the fact. The sergeant gave a low whistle. That's devilish clever. Not clever enough, Miss Marple replied softly. As the afternoon deepened, she asked to see the Colonel's correspondence. Sims brought a box of letters, all arranged chronologically. Most were dull. Bills, military associations, estate matters, but one stood out. An envelope, unsealed, with a single line inside. The words were written in a neat but oddly heavy hand. Forgive, or you shall not be forgiven. No signature, no date. Bailey scowled. Sounds like some sort of threat. Or a plea, Miss Marple said, depending on the sender. Yet why leave it unsealed, almost as though it were meant to be discovered? She tucked the letter back into its envelope with care. Our Colonel was stern, yes, but I suspect there were matters of the heart or conscience at play. That scrap of cloth was not chosen at random. It points to something spiritual, or pretends to. What caught her eye next was subtler still. On the mantel, among the regimented array of medals and photographs, stood a small porcelain figure of the Virgin Mary. Its base bore a faint smear of wax, though there was no candle near it. Miss Marple leaned in, touching the residue with her fingertip. The wax was recent, pale and soft. She straightened slowly. "Curious," she whispered. "Very curious indeed." The wax suggested a votive candle, the kind used in prayer, though none were kept in the library. It hinted that someone, perhaps recently, had conducted a ritual of sorts here. And yet, who in this household would pray so fervently in secrecy? She said nothing to Bailey, not yet. Instead, she walked again to the window. The latch was secure, the curtain edges aligned. But at the sill, near the hinge, she saw the faintest trace of something dark, a smear like soot. Odd, for there had been no fire in the grate for days. She touched it lightly and raised her fingertip. Not soot, but candle ash. At that moment, the clock on the mantel struck 4, the chimes resonating through the heavy silence. Miss Marple glanced back at the Colonel's body, still solemn in its repose. The scene was too neat, too curated, like a stage play set to mislead its audience, and she, for her part, was determined not to be misled. Already she felt the threads of deception knotting together, a scrap of linen smelling of violets, a letter of forgiveness unsigned, a figure of the Virgin smeared with candle wax, a butler too careful with his face, and a nephew too careless with his shoes. Each was a fragment, meaningless alone, but together they whispered of something carefully orchestrated. The authorities would catalogue evidence, question alibis, and wait on the coroner's word. But Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and quiet persistence, knew the truth lay not in the official record, but in the smallest incongruities. She settled back in the armchair, her expression mild as ever. The household thought her an old lady idly sipping tea among them. Only Bailey noticed the flicker of sharp calculation behind her gaze. And so the keenest eye in St. Hathercombe had arrived, and with it the first veil of deception began to lift. Miss Marple asked quite gently that the household be gathered in the drawing-room. She did not raise her voice nor exert any authority, yet such was her manner that even those reluctant obeyed her without protest. The fire there had been lit against the damp air, and its glow lent the room a deceptive warmth, though every face reflected unease. Sergeant Bailey took up his place near the hearth, notebook ready. The Colonel's body had been removed at last, but the weight of his presence lingered. Miss Marple, seated in a straight-backed chair, folded her gloved hands in her lap, and looked at each person in turn. She was not formidable, nor stern, but her eyes were searching in their gentleness, and none escaped their notice. "Let us begin simply," she said. "Tell us how the household passed the evening before the Colonel was found. Each of you, in your own words. The smallest details are sometimes the most illuminating." Mr. Sims, the butler, inclined his head with practised dignity. After dinner, which was taken at 7:30, the Colonel retired to his library as he always did. I cleared the table with the maids, and then I attended to the wine cellar for inventory. At 10 o'clock, I checked the drawing-room windows and retired myself. I did not see the Colonel again. He spoke evenly, his tone measured, but Miss Marple noted that his hands tightened around the back of the chair before him. "Thank you, Sims. And the maids?" The elder of the two, Mary, spoke first, her voice thin. "We finished with the dishes just after 8. I went upstairs to mend linens, miss. I didn't leave my room until morning." The younger maid, Elsie, kept her eyes down. "I stayed in the kitchen with cook for a while. We played cards after she tidied things away. I never went near the library." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Cards, my dear? How very pleasant. And did you win?" Elsie blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, miss. 2 hands. Out of 3. "A lucky night, then," Miss Marple said softly. "And cook, did you notice the same?" Cook, a heavy-set woman with ruddy cheeks, nodded emphatically. That's the truth of it. Elsie was winning, though she was distracted, kept glancing toward the passage every time she heard a creak. Said she thought someone was moving about. The girl's cheeks flushed and she wrung her hands. It was nothing, miss. Only the house settling. But Miss Marple had seen the quick dart of her eyes toward Sims as she spoke. "And you, Mr. Edmund?" she asked gently. The Colonel's nephew straightened from where he leaned against the mantel. He gave a shrug that was half careless, half defensive. "I dined here, of course, though my uncle and I exchanged few words. Afterwards, I went to the village inn. Some friends of mine were playing billiards. I returned rather late, perhaps after midnight. I went straight to bed. If you like, I can provide names. Half the village saw me there." "Very thoughtful," Miss Marple said, though her gaze rested on the faint smudge of earth still clinging to his trousers. "You must have walked back, then, at that late hour?" "Yes. The air clears one's head." "Indeed," she murmured, eyes dropping as though the matter were of no consequence. The room fell into silence. Each had spoken, but the effect was not clarity. It was a web of small threads, some taut, some frayed. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "I wonder," she said, "that no one heard the Colonel ring for assistance. He was a man of regularity. If some discomfort overtook him, would he not summon help?" Sims answered quickly. "He valued his privacy above all. He would not ring lightly." "Perhaps," she said mildly. "Yet I cannot help but think of the locked door. Such careful privacy for a man so exact. Strange, is it not, that he should alter his habit on the very night of his death?" At this, Sims's lips thinned again, and Edmund shifted uncomfortably. The maids exchanged nervous glances. Bailey cleared his throat. "Ma'am, forgive me, but we'll need clearer statements than these suspicions. Everyone seems to be pointing nowhere." "Not nowhere, Sergeant," Miss Marple replied, "merely in too many directions at once." She turned back to the group. "You see, there are contradictions. Sims, you say you were in the wine cellar. Yet Cook, did you not remark yesterday morning that you found the cellar door ajar when you went for salt?" Cook blinked. "So I did. Thought nothing of it." "And Elsie," Miss Marple continued, "you say you never went near the library, yet you seem to know there were noises in the passage." The girl's face burned. I only thought—" "Dear child," Miss Marple said kindly, "you need not be afraid. Fear makes liars of us all." The silence stretched. At last Edmund broke it with a sharp laugh. "This is absurd. My uncle was old and cruel. Perhaps he simply collapsed. Must we all be turned into suspects over a locked door and a rag?" Miss Marple regarded him gently. "You are quite right that death sometimes comes naturally. But you see, young man, it is the nature of truth to reveal itself in trifles. And here we have trifles in abundance. A door locked contrary to habit, a cloth perfumed when it should not be, footsteps heard when none were admitted. One cannot dismiss them all." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Then you suspect us all?" "No," she said softly. "I suspect that one of you is playing a part. Some of you too eager to appear innocent, others holding back too much. Both extremes betray the truth." Her words seemed to ripple through the room. Sims stiffened. Edmund scowled. Elsie trembled. Cook crossed herself, and Mary stared at the carpet. In each face she saw not answers but deceptions, some born of guilt, others of fear, still others of long-buried resentments. Bailey scribbled furiously in his notebook, muttering under his breath. Miss Marple only sat back once more, serene as ever. "The Colonel's death," she said at last, "was not an act of chance. Someone here knows why he died, and though your voices weave different patterns, I promise you this, The fabric will not hold. Every thread that does not belong will unravel, until the truth is bare. The fire crackled, and no one dared move. They had given their stories, but Miss Marple knew the heart of the matter was only beginning to show. Hidden motives lurked in their words, in their glances, in the tremor of their hands. Deception was thick in the air, and she, more patient than any, would wait for it to falter. And so, in the drawing-room of Whitmore Manor, beneath the watchful eye of a quiet old lady, the voices of deception began to betray themselves. The storm broke that night, rain tapping insistently at the high windows of Whitmore Manor, wind pressing at the shutters with long sighs. The house, already heavy with silence, seemed to groan under the weather's weight. Miss Marple sat in the library once more, a lamp at her elbow, and the Colonel's desk spread before her. She had asked Sergeant Bailey to leave her for an hour. He had done so reluctantly, but Miss Marple needed the hush of solitude to let the patterns form. On the desk lay her notes, small neat jottings on slips of paper she had requested from Sims. Each name was circled, each detail tucked beside it like stitches in embroidery. She knew already that every one of them, from the dutiful butler to the bitter nephew, had reason enough to wish Colonel Whitmore dead. Yet none of their motives alone accounted for the peculiar staging of the scene. That was what troubled her. The death had been too carefully arranged, too deliberate in its misdirection. Greed was the most obvious motive, and it pointed toward Edmund. The young man's disdain for his uncle was clear, and he stood to inherit not only the manor but also a considerable fortune. Miss Marple had seen that soil upon his trousers, and she knew it was not idle neglect. The grounds were sodden after days of drizzle, and a late-night walk from the inn would indeed have marked his shoes. Yet the garden earth suggested something more, something hidden or retrieved. Perhaps a candle discarded, she mused, or an item concealed. Edmund's freedom from want depended on the Colonel's death, and greed made men bold. But revenge, too, had its voice in the household. The maids whispered of the Colonel's temper, and Cook's flustered manner suggested long years of fear. Mary, the elder maid, had scars not on her skin but in the tightness of her shoulders, the way her eyes slid from any mention of the Colonel. Miss Marple had seen such postures before, the bearing of one long accustomed to reprimand, too harsh, too frequent. Revenge could flower quietly in such soil, a slow bloom of resentment that finally, when the chance arose, would strike. Yet Mary lacked the cunning for deception so elaborate. If she had a hand in it, it was not hers alone. Sims, the butler, was more difficult. 30 years of service bound him to the Colonel's shadow, and yet what was loyalty after such a span? Sims had given his best years to a man who valued obedience over kindness. There had been, Miss Marple recalled, cases where long-service men turned against their masters not out of sudden malice, but from the bitter realization that nothing had been gained from their sacrifice. Fear, too, might have driven him, fear of dismissal, of a will altered, of a secret discovered. His glance toward the linen scrap, so fleeting yet so sharp, suggested knowledge he dared not voice. Was it possible he had staged the nun's token himself, leaning upon the Colonel's religious austerity to mask his crime? And then there was Elsie, poor trembling child. Her contradiction, the denial of hearing footsteps when Cook had sworn she remarked on them, was telling, but Miss Marple felt it was not malice in the girl. Fear drove Elsie, fear of being entangled, fear of punishment. What had she seen? What did she know? And was her silence her own choice, or had someone pressed her into it? A frightened girl might lie to protect herself, or to protect someone else. Miss Marple turned next to the letter on the desk, the one that had read, "Forgive, or you shall not be forgiven." Its script was precise but heavy, the hand of someone unused to writing in such a formal style. She traced the strokes with her finger, thinking. Was it a plea from an old comrade, a servant wronged, a relation estranged? It hinted at something intimate, something outside the cold bounds of money or inheritance, perhaps jealousy, perhaps betrayal. The Colonel had been a man of secrets, for all his rigid discipline. What if one of those secrets had returned to claim him? She lifted her gaze to the porcelain figure of the Virgin. That smear of wax troubled her. It whispered of someone in the household seeking absolution, someone who had prayed in desperation before or after the deed. That pointed not to greed, but to guilt. It painted the crime as more than calculation. It painted it as burdened by conscience, and conscience narrowed the field. The rain rattled harder against the windows. Miss Marple folded her hands and closed her eyes, letting the fragments swirl. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear, each had its candidate, each had its truth, but none alone could have locked the library door, planted the perfumed cloth, and left the Colonel arranged so deliberately. No, the crime was too intricate for one hand alone. She was beginning to see the outline of a conspiracy, or at the very least, collusion. The threads wove together, and she must tug at them one by one until the web revealed its design. When Bailey returned, shaking the rain from his cap, he found her still in thought. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've spoken again to the nephew. He swears half the inn can place him there. He insists on his alibi." Miss Marple opened her eyes. Yes, and so he would. But an alibi is only as strong as its weakest moment. If he left the inn even briefly, who would notice? Men at billiards are not the keenest observers. "You think he slipped out?" "I think he may have, but he did not act alone." Bailey looked startled. "More than one." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Consider, Sergeant. A door locked from within, a token placed, a letter left in plain sight. These are layers of deception, like curtains drawn one over another. One hand might be clever, yes, but two or more could weave them tighter, each with their own reason, their own fear or anger. The Colonel was a man who sowed bitterness. Now we reap it." Bailey frowned, trying to picture it. "So, which is it then? Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear?" "All of them, perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "Motives do not live apart, Sergeant. They twine together, like ivy up the walls of a crumbling house, and somewhere in that tangle lies the truth." The wind sighed against the shutters. The house creaked. In the drawing-room the household sat restless, whispering among themselves, each watching the other. Miss Marple walked slowly toward them, her eyes gentle, her voice mild. But within her the pattern was forming, and she knew the maze of motives was not endless. Sooner or later one path would lead her to the heart of the crime, and when it did, the walls of deception would begin to fall. Morning light crept pale and reluctant through the high windows of Whitmore Manor, laying a thin wash of gold over the damp lawn. Inside, the constabulary busied themselves with what they believed was resolution. Sergeant Bailey, flushed with urgency, marched into the library carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Miss Marple, who sat quietly with her knitting by the hearth, glanced up as he laid the parcel, triumphantly on the desk. "Found in the garden shed, ma'am," he said, barely keeping the satisfaction from his voice, hidden under a pile of coal sacks. "You'll want to see this." He pulled back the paper, and there it was, a length of white linen, its edge stitched with a blue cross, torn roughly at one corner, the very counterpart to the scrap clutched in the Colonel's hand. Unlike the fragment, however, this piece was intact enough to be recognized for what it was, a wimple, part of a nun's habit, and upon it, faint but visible, were dark stains that looked alarmingly like blood. Bailey's eyes shone. "There's your answer. No phantom nun, no mystery at all. Someone in this house planted the fragment to throw us off, but the full garment's here, and it has blood. Sims swore he knew nothing of it, but the shed key was on his ring. No one else could have hidden it there. He's our man." Miss Marple set down her knitting with great care, her expression mild. "I see," she said softly. "And you believe Sims staged the scene?" "Who else?" Bailey pressed. "The butler of 30 years, bitter, overlooked, perhaps fearful of dismissal. He had access to every room, every key. He could have done it all. Locked the door, placed the cloth, arranged the body. And now the garment is hidden where only he could place it. It fits." Within the hour, Sims was summoned before them, his face pale but his composure rigid. The inspector from the county town, hastily arrived on Bailey's telegram, wasted no time. "Mr. Sims, you are under suspicion of murder," he declared with an air of finality. We shall hold you for questioning. The evidence is clear." Simms's hands trembled as he protested. "I swear upon my honour, I never placed that thing in the shed. I never laid a hand upon the Colonel save to serve him. I may have been weary of his ways, but I am no murderer." His voice cracked, and he looked to Miss Marple with something close to desperation. But the inspector was unmoved. "Save your words for the magistrate. The garment seals your guilt." The household, gathered in tense silence, exchanged looks of grim relief and quiet fear. Cook crossed herself. Mary stared at her hands. Elsie wept softly. Edmund smirked faintly, as though satisfied that the matter would now be tidied away. Miss Marple alone did not rejoice. She rose slowly, smoothing her skirt, and approached the linen. She bent over it, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then delicately she touched the blue cross stitched at the hem. The thread was bright, unfrayed, the stitches neat as if newly made. She pressed her nose closer to the fabric. The scent of violets clung faintly still, but stronger, fresher than on the fragment. "Curious," she murmured. The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You doubt the evidence, madam?" "I only observe," she said quietly. "This cloth, though it matches the scrap, appears strangely untouched by time. Its thread is bright, its perfume unweathered. One would expect that if it had been clutched by a dying man, the fragment and its counterpart would carry the same signs of wear. Yet this appears almost new." Bailey frowned. "New or old, it's still the same cloth." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. "But bloodstains too, Sergeant, tell their own story. If this were the Colonel's blood, it would have darkened, stiffened the weave. Instead, these stains remain tacky, as though painted on but hours ago." The inspector scoffed. "You suggest forgery of evidence? That is far-fetched." "Not so far," Miss Marple said, still soft, "if one wished to mislead." Her eyes swept the room. Edmund's smirk had faltered. Elsie stared wide-eyed. Cook shifted uneasily, and Sims, for all his rigidity, looked stunned, as though he himself had never seen the cloth until that moment. "I do not say this exonerates Mr. Sims entirely," Miss Marple continued, "but I should hesitate to declare victory. The truth seldom proclaims itself so loudly." The inspector bristled, but said nothing more. Sims was led away under guard, though Miss Marple's quiet dissent lingered in the air like a draught that would not be shut out. The household dispersed, yet unease remained, sharper now than before. That evening Miss Marple walked the corridors alone, her slippers whispering against the boards. She paused at the library once more. The wax smear on the porcelain figure still caught her eye, and the ash on the window-sill. Someone in this house had gone to great lengths not merely to kill, but to veil the killing in symbols of faith and absolution. And now someone had gone further still, planting false evidence to direct suspicion toward the butler. She thought of Edmund's smirk. Too ready, too pleased. And yet his motive of greed was almost too plain, too expected. Could he be bold enough to plant evidence, yet foolish enough to smirk when others accepted it? That was the mark of a young man who believed himself cleverer than he was. But was it truly he? Or was someone else moving pieces while he believed himself the player? Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, knitting once more, her needles clicking gently in the hush. The authorities were content. They had their suspect, their cloth, their neat explanation. They would write their reports, close their files, and sleep satisfied. But Miss Marple did not sleep, for she knew the true criminal had not yet shown their hand. They had hidden behind planted cloth and false blood, behind the rigid figure of a butler long used as the household scapegoat, and such a one, bold enough to weave lies upon lies, would not be content to stop. Somewhere in the house, she felt, the real culprit watched with quiet triumph, waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for the right moment to strike again if need be. And Jane Marple, with her quiet knitting and patient eyes, waited too. The rain had finally relented by the following morning, leaving the gardens of Whitmore Manor damp and glistening in the early sun. Miss Marple, however, was less interested in the wet roses than in the quiet corners of memory and human habit. She had spent the night poring over her notes and observations, replaying each conversation, each glance, each slip of the tongue. The house was outwardly calm, but the quiet, she knew, was often the most dangerous state. Her thoughts returned, as they so often did, to the letter she had seen among the Colonel's correspondence. "Forgive, or you shall not be forgiven." The words were heavy, intimate, and old in their implication. She had been unable to place them, and yet, in the fog of the early morning, a shadow of recognition crept across her mind. The handwriting, the deliberate, almost ornamental capitals of the first word, reminded her of a letter she had once glimpsed decades ago, in another village entirely, concerning a family dispute that had ended with a servant dismissed under scandalous circumstances. That case had seemed closed, long forgotten, yet some elements now hummed in her memory as relevant. Bailey arrived to escort her once again through the house. They walked slowly, deliberately, past the long corridors that smelled faintly of damp wood and polished brass. Miss Marple's eyes, however, sought not the surfaces, but the spaces between them, the hidden grooves, the footprints in dust, the corners where the past might linger. "I've been thinking, Sergeant," she said softly, "about connections that are not immediately visible. We've assumed that each motive belongs to one person, isolated. But sometimes motives stretch across generations, and actions are shaped by what has come before." Bailey frowned. "You mean someone here has a grudge going back decades?" "Not exactly," she said. "But someone's family, someone's associations, someone's loyalties, they can echo, and echoes are often louder than the present moment." They reached the library, still undisturbed except for the evidence parcel Bailey had recovered. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the blot of fresh wax on the virgin figure, and then her attention drifted to the mantelpiece photographs. Colonel Whitmore in uniform, young and stern with his family behind him. She noted something she had missed before, a woman in one photograph, unassuming, seated quietly at the side, whose features bore a curious resemblance to one of the maids, Mary. "Bailey," she murmured, tracing the contours with her finger. "Do you see this? That young girl upstairs, Mary, her eyes, her mouth, the shape of her jaw. She is related to this woman, perhaps a niece, perhaps more distant. But there is a tie, a thread of loyalty or resentment that may have lasted decades. It is not simple family affection. It is something older, something preserved in silence." Bailey looked sceptical. A connection like that, would it matter for the Colonel's death? "Connections," Miss Marple replied, "are often what transform opportunity into action. People act not only for themselves, but for those they care about, or resent, or wish to protect. I believe that someone here has acted, at least in part, in response to the past, not merely the present." She paced slowly, considering each suspect. Edmund, with his greed, was obvious. Yet why would he smirk at the suggestion that a butler could be the culprit, if not because he expected someone else to bear the blame? Sims, trained for obedience and secrecy, seemed a convenient scapegoat. Elsie and Cook, governed by fear, might have been pawns rather than players, and Mary, the elder maid, whose presence had been quiet, almost invisible, could hold the key. She had been overlooked because she seemed harmless, but harmlessness often masks memory and subtle knowledge. Miss Marple remembered another detail, easily forgotten by the authorities: the candle ash at the window. It had not come from the library alone. The faint blackened residue matched not one but two rooms upstairs. One of them was Mary's attic chamber, a space rarely entered. There she had kept a small box of letters and papers from her family, collected over the years, some unsigned, some cryptic, some accusing. Miss Marple suspected one of these had surfaced, and in a flash of fear, Mary or someone acting for her may have acted to silence the Colonel. She rose from her chair, motioning for Bailey to follow. Together they moved upstairs, where the air smelled of old wood, lavender and dust. Miss Marple opened the door to Mary's room, and the girl, caught in the act of tidying her few belongings, froze. "Mary," Miss Marple said softly. "May I?" She pointed to a small trunk beneath the window. The girl nodded, trembling. Miss Marple lifted the lid. Inside were letters, well preserved, carefully stacked. One fell open almost immediately. The handwriting was familiar, ornamental, deliberate. The opening words matched precisely the style of "forgive," or "you shall not be forgiven." Bailey gasped quietly. You mean the letter was hers? Miss Marple shook her head. Not hers exactly, but she had access to it, and she knew its meaning. Someone has taken the echo of an old grievance, one long buried, and used it to craft the present crime. That is why the linen, the staged death, the wax, and even the perfumed fragment, all of it, has roots older than the Colonel's life at Whitmore Manor. Someone remembered what had been done before and sought to finish the account. Mary's lips quivered. I didn't mean, it was supposed to warn him, not... Miss Marple's gaze softened. Ah, my dear, sometimes warnings are misunderstood, and acts meant to caution become fatal. But now you see why secrecy and shadows of the past are so dangerous. They weave webs that can entrap the present. It was then that Miss Marple realized the full breadth of the connection. Not only Mary, but Edmund and Elsie, perhaps even Sims, were entangled in ways the inspector could not have foreseen. Bloodlines, old grievances, and unspoken debts had intersected. The crime was not the work of a single motive, but of history, buried and left unexamined until it erupted violently. Miss Marple turned back to Bailey. You see, Sergeant, this is why one must not accept a simple solution. The threads of yesterday often dictate the movements of today, and the cleverness of a criminal lies in exploiting what we assume to be forgotten. Once the past is recognized, once its weight is understood, the present begins to make sense. Bailey nodded, his eyes wide. So the Colonel's death, it wasn't just about greed or revenge in the present. It was about all of it together, and the past reaching forward. Exactly, she said. And once we recognize that, the next steps are clearer. We must see not only what was done, but why it was done, and who had the knowledge to weave these threads together. Only then can the final unveiling occur. The sun fell fully on the manor grounds, casting long shadows across the wet gravel. Miss Marple stood at the window, considering the intricate lattice of human emotion and memory that had led to Colonel Whitmore's death. The past had risen quietly, unnoticed, and shaped the present in ways no one had suspected. And in that quiet understanding, Miss Marple felt the edge of revelation stir, knowing that the true resolution, the moment when deception would finally be stripped bare, was at last within reach. Miss Marple had spent the morning in quiet contemplation, her knitting untouched beside the lamp. She did not hurry. Speed was the enemy of subtle observation. By mid-afternoon she had a plan, though it was less a formal scheme than a gentle invitation to reveal truth. The conventional methods of inquiry, the formal questioning, the scrutiny of evidence, had yielded fragments and hints, but no decisive breakthrough. Something unconventional was required. She called the household together once more in the drawing-room. The storm had passed, leaving the afternoon sun dappled and soft, illuminating the anxious faces of those gathered. Miss Marple did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to settle over them. Her eyes swept the room with the patience of a fisherman waiting for the subtle twitch of a line. "Let us try something different," she said at last, her voice gentle. "We have been speaking of what we saw, and of what we think we know, but I would like each of you to assist me with a small exercise, a test, if you like, of perception and honesty." The household exchanged uneasy glances. Edmund leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to hide the faint flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Sims stood stiffly, hands clasped, lips pressed in habitual restraint. Mary and Elsie fidgeted with their skirts, while Cook adjusted her apron nervously. "I have," Miss Marple continued, producing a small box from a table, "a number of objects. Most are ordinary, some quite ordinary indeed, but one has significance relating to the events that have occurred. I should like each of you to observe these objects in turn, and tell me which seems to you most out of place, or perhaps most remarkable." She opened the box carefully, revealing a set of small, seemingly inconsequential items: a thimble, a penknife, a candlestick, a fragment of blue-threaded linen, a small vial with a faint violet scent, and a miniature porcelain figure of the Virgin Mary. She did not place emphasis on any one item, merely invited attention. One by one, the household members approached. Edmund picked up the penknife first, turned it over, and frowned. "Sharp," he said, "but ordinary." He returned it, his tone casual. Too casual, perhaps. Sims handled the candlestick, examining it closely. "Clean brass," he said. "Nothing unusual." He replaced it with careful deliberation, almost reverence. Elsie's hands shook as she reached for the thimble, then dropped it. I don't know what to look for," she whispered. Cook lingered over the violet-scented vial. She inhaled delicately, then recoiled slightly. "Perfumed," she murmured. "It's, faintly familiar." Finally Mary approached. Miss Marple said nothing, only waited. Mary lifted the porcelain figure. Her fingers trembled and she stared at it longer than necessary. Then almost imperceptibly she touched the base. Her eyes widened and her lips parted as though to speak. Then she stilled. Miss Marple leaned forward, knitting needles paused in mid-air. "Ah," she said softly. "You noticed the wax, the residue." The candle Mary's shoulders twitched. She looked about the room as though seeking an escape, but her gaze inevitably returned to Miss Marple. I don't know what you mean," she said, voice tight. "You do," Miss Marple said, still gentle, "and yet you wish not to speak. That is entirely understandable. Many things in a house of this sort are learned over years of silent observation. You have learned where objects are kept, and perhaps what they signify, but a small slip is sometimes revealing." Bailey, standing beside the hearth, frowned. "I don't understand, ma'am. How does this prove anything?" "It proves, Sergeant, that some people cannot resist the urge to respond to what they know," Miss Marple said, "even when they strive to conceal it. Notice how Mary lingered over the figure, while others barely noticed it. That moment tells me she has knowledge the rest of the household does not. Perhaps she saw what I suspected, perhaps even took part, either willingly or under duress. The response is subtle, but unmistakable to the attentive eye." Mary's hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. I didn't do anything. I only knew of it." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And that is what I must learn, my dear. Knowledge without action can be innocent, or it can be dangerous. It is the knowing, the participation in secrecy, that weighs upon one." Edmund shifted in his chair. "So you're saying Mary is involved? That she—" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But she is a link, someone whose past observations, whose hidden awareness, connect to the events we have been trying to understand. And those who are clever know how to exploit such knowledge. Sometimes revealing nothing can be as revealing as confession." Bailey scribbled notes furiously. "So what do we do with this, ma'am?" "We observe further," Miss Marple said, rising. "We continue to watch not what is said, but what is unspoken. One unconcealed reaction, one small tremor, can unravel layers of deception faster than interrogation or accusation. The truth is a delicate creature. Push too hard, and it flees. But provide a gentle mirror, and it will reveal itself in time." Mary lowered her eyes, but the tension in her shoulders remained. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, lifting her knitting once more. "Patience, Sergeant. The cleverest criminal is often the one who hides behind others' assumptions, but even the most cautious cannot suppress every involuntary gesture. One slip, a prolonged glance, a faltering word, these are the clues we must trust." Later, in the quiet of the hallway, Miss Marple reflected on the effectiveness of her tactic. Others might have dismissed the objects as trivial or sentimental. Even Bailey had nearly overlooked the significance of their presentation. But she had seen the subtle cue, the pause, the hesitation, the momentary widening of the eyes. Somewhere in that hesitation lay a crack in the carefully constructed deception. It was not enough yet for a conclusion, but it was enough to guide the next step. Miss Marple understood that patience, observation, and the gentle provocation of conscience were as powerful as the most meticulous forensic method. By evening the household was restless, unsure why the day had passed without the usual inquisition, yet uneasy at the silent scrutiny. Only Mary carried the weight of her reaction, small though it had been, and it had not gone unnoticed. Miss Marple's unconventional method, inviting each person to examine the familiar in a new light, had revealed the first genuine fracture in the facade, and in that fracture she knew lay the path forward. The real truth, buried beneath layers of fear, greed, and inherited resentment, had begun to reveal itself, one subtle crack at a time. The following morning dawned bright and clear, yet the crisp light brought little comfort to Whitmore Manor. Miss Marple had been reviewing her notes once again in the library, tracing patterns in the chronology of events and the subtle reactions she had observed. She had become increasingly certain that Mary's brief hesitation over the porcelain figure was more than nervousness. It was a signal, a key to unlocking the final strands of the tangled web. Bailey entered, brisk and uneasy, holding his notebook like a shield. "Ma'am, there's a problem," he said immediately, his eyes flicking toward the desk. "The linen fragment, the one from the garden shed, the parcel, it's gone. Vanished. The inspector is certain he left it here last night. Now it isn't anywhere." Miss Marple rose slowly. Her knitting dropped onto the chair. She examined the desk, the floor around it, the shelves above, and the small cabinet beside it. The space was undisturbed except for the faint swirl of dust that marked where the parcel had been. "Gone," she murmured. "Someone does not wish this to be seen again." "Could it have been misplaced?" Bailey asked. "Unlikely," she said. "It was accounted for and untouched since it was examined yesterday. And the manner of disappearance, silent, precise, suggests a deliberate act." The household gathered soon after, drawn by the sudden commotion. Faces pale, voices anxious. Edmund crossed his arms, masking irritation, while Cook muttered quietly about misfortune and spirits. Elsie's hands trembled again, and Mary kept her gaze firmly on the floor, as if attempting invisibility itself. The inspector arrived shortly after, red-faced and flustered. "It seems our key piece of evidence has been removed," he said. "Without it, prosecution will be difficult. Someone here has interfered." Miss Marple, however, did not speak immediately. She walked slowly among the group, observing every twitch of eye, every tightening of hands. Her gaze lingered longest on Mary, whose pallor now mirrored her own unease. "The disappearance of evidence," she said finally, in her soft, deliberate tone, "is rarely a simple matter. Someone desires that what is hidden remain hidden, yet the act itself, the manner of taking, is revealing. Only a person familiar with the location, confident of their timing, and unobserved could do this," Bailey muttered under his breath. "So it's an insider. Someone in the house?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and their nervousness, or their casualness, provides more insight than the evidence itself." She looked at Mary. "You understand the significance of the fragment, do you not?" Mary's shoulders shook. I didn't take it. I didn't." "Of course," Miss Marple said quietly, "but the presence of knowledge often drives one to protect oneself, or another, or both. Fear can do that." Edmund shifted, frowning. "This is ridiculous. Are we all to be accused of handling things unseen? Perhaps the wind carried it off." "The wind, Edmund," Miss Marple said mildly, "cannot open parcels and remove linen from a sealed box, nor can it choose its timing so precisely. Only a hand guided by purpose, and a mind aware of what must be hidden, could accomplish this." Cook's gaze flicked toward Mary again, as if seeking reassurance. Elsie's lips pressed into a tight line, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Sims, standing rigidly near the door, looked as if he might step forward in protest, but held himself in check. Miss Marple moved to the window, peering at the wet gravel and the gardens beyond. "We must consider the possibility that the fragment will not be returned, that it may be destroyed entirely. Someone is attempting to redirect the course of this investigation to prevent the truth from emerging." Bailey ran a hand through his hair. "Do you mean the case might be lost?" "No," Miss Marple said firmly, "merely delayed. The disappearance of evidence does not erase the crime. It only tests our ability to see what is still present, to follow the subtler signs, and to discern the patterns that remain." Her eyes swept the room once more, catching the flicker of guilt and apprehension in small, telling gestures. The quick glance between Edmund and Mary, the way Elsie's fingers nervously twisted her apron, Sims's rigid posture. These were shadows cast by unseen truths. The linen fragment might have vanished, but it had already left its mark on human behaviour. Later, when the house had settled into the uneasy quiet of midday, Miss Marple asked to see the drawers and cupboards in the nursery quarters, long thought to be of little significance. She observed locks, small gaps in cabinetry, dust displaced in slight swirls, and a faint scent of violets, subtle but distinct. Her eyes narrowed. Someone had carried the fragment through these rooms, perhaps intending to hide or destroy it, but had inadvertently left traces in their wake. She crouched slightly, touching the faint smudges on the wooden floor. "See here, Sergeant," she said softly. "Even in absence, evidence speaks. The fragment's removal, while apparently clever, leaves a trail in behaviour, scent, and dust. The criminal seeks to bury truth, but cannot escape the human element of carelessness." Bailey bent over beside her. "So you're saying we can still follow it, even if it's gone?" "Precisely," she said. "Objects are helpful, but people reveal far more. Fear, guilt, pride, desire. These cannot vanish with a linen scrap. And the person who removed it underestimates both observation and patience. They believe the authorities' reliance on tangible evidence is absolute. But it is not. Human reactions, once carefully read, are far more telling." The household continued their routines under the quiet watch of Miss Marple, tension thick in the air. Trust had become a fragile thing. Every glance, every hesitation, every casual movement was suspect. The authorities were frustrated, the fragment was missing, and the investigation appeared stalled. Yet Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, quietly tracing the invisible trail. By evening, she called the household once again to the drawing-room, not for accusation, but for observation. She placed the chair by the fire where she had sat since the investigation began. Knitting paused in her lap. Her eyes swept the group, settling on those whose reactions betrayed thoughtfulness, anxiety, or overcompensation. "The vanishing of evidence," she said softly, "is a challenge, not a defeat. One cannot erase what is already known, and one cannot hide from careful observation. I have no doubt that the fragment will influence actions, whether seen or unseen, and that one among us has allowed impatience or fear to betray them. The truth remains, though it may now lie in shadows rather than in plain sight." A silence settled over the room, dense and uneasy. Every person present felt it, Miss Marple's calm, unhurried scrutiny. It was not a rush to judgment, but a quiet certainty that no act, no matter how careful, could remain concealed forever. And somewhere in the manor, the individual who had removed the fragment sat in tension, unaware that their own reactions had already begun to expose them. The game had shifted, the evidence was gone, but the web of observation had tightened. Miss Marple, knitting once more, allowed a faint smile. The stakes were higher now, the truth more fiercely guarded, but so too was her resolve. The vanishing evidence had not silenced the story. It had only made the detective's eye more acute, the watchfulness more absolute, and the path to revelation more inevitable. The manor was quieter than usual that evening. The windows were closed against the lingering chill, the last of the storm's dampness still clinging to the stone, and a sense of uneasy anticipation hung over the household. Miss Marple had spent the afternoon retracing steps, mentally reviewing the vanished fragment, the reactions of Mary and the others, and the faint traces of violets she had noted in the nursery. The sense that the case was on the verge of resolution had been tempered by the sudden loss of crucial evidence, and she remained watchful, knowing the criminal was clever, patient, and willing to act again. Bailey had just returned from delivering a message to the village post, the clatter of his boots muted by the carpeted hallways, when a scream shattered the calm. Miss Marple rose instantly, her knitting falling to the floor, and rushed toward the source, the servants' wing at the far end of the manor. The scream had come from the kitchen. Cook was standing at the door, eyes wide and pointing shakily toward the pantry. There, slumped against the wall, lay Elsie, pale and trembling, a deep gash marking her temple. A pool of blood stained the floorboards, a small knife lying several feet away, its handle slick with crimson. Bailey dropped to his knees beside her. "She's alive," he muttered, checking for pulse, "just barely conscious. But who?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room with calm precision. Nothing had been disturbed except for the movement necessary to commit this attack. No forced entry, no sign of struggle beyond Elsie herself. This was not a random act of violence. It was deliberate, targeted, and intimate. "Someone wanted to silence her," Miss Marple said softly, bending to examine the knife. She noted the faint residue of violets on the handle, the same subtle scent she had traced to the vanished linen fragment. Her eyes narrowed. Whoever had taken the fragment had left a calling card, a scent meant to connect the two acts, and now someone had escalated, attacking not the Colonel, not the evidence directly, but a witness, Elsie, whose knowledge could implicate them. The household gathered once again, trembling and wide-eyed. Edmund's face was pale, Mary's hands clasped tightly before her. Sims had leaned against the wall, knuckles white. Cook was in near panic, muttering prayers under her breath. "Who could have done this?" Bailey demanded. Miss Marple shook her head. "Not who, Sergeant, but who knew what. The perpetrator is someone intimately familiar with the house and the people within it. Someone patient enough to wait, clever enough to anticipate actions, and bold enough to strike a second time when suspicion begins to shift. This is no longer simply a murder investigation. It is a matter of preventing further harm." She moved closer to Elsie, kneeling beside the girl. "Tell me, dear, who came near you? Did you see anyone before you were attacked?" Elsie's eyes fluttered, tears streaking her cheeks. I didn't see, only felt. Someone grabbed me from behind. I tried to scream, but..." Her voice faltered. "From behind," Miss Marple repeated softly. "That suggests confidence, Sergeant. The attacker did not expect resistance. They had rehearsed this, known when to act, and trusted that no one else would intervene. Observe. No signs of a struggle beyond the initial moment. Whoever it was knew exactly how to approach, how to intimidate, and how to retreat undetected." Mary shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed tightly together, eyes darting to Edmund. Miss Marple caught the glance. It was fleeting, but the faint tension between them revealed nothing direct, yet implied something indirect. She filed the observation silently, as one might note a loose thread for later examination. The inspector arrived not long after, summoning the household to the drawing-room once again. His face was set in frustration and alarm. "We have a second violent act," he said. "We cannot ignore this. Someone is escalating. We must question all present and account for everyone's whereabouts. No one may leave until we have clarity." Miss Marple, however, was already several steps ahead. She allowed the inspector to speak, to dictate, while she observed the subtle shifts in posture, the involuntary fidgets, the avoidance of eye contact. She noted the way Edmund's foot tapped too quickly, the tightening of Sims's jaw, the trembling of Mary's hands, even as she tried to seem calm. These were shadows cast by guilt, uncertainty, or knowledge, and the detective recognized each for what it was, a map to the mind of the criminal. Later, in a quiet moment, Miss Marple sought out Bailey in the hall. "Sergeant, do you recall the vanished fragment?" she asked, voice low. Bailey nodded. "Yes, ma'am. What about it?" "It is not gone entirely," she said. "It may have been moved, yes, but the attacker left a trail of scent and pattern. They underestimated the ability of observation to follow subtle signs. The violets on the knife, the way the pantry was approached, the lack of disturbance elsewhere, all these point to someone who thinks themselves invisible. And now that they have struck again, they reveal their impatience. Someone is becoming overconfident." Bailey frowned. "So we still have a chance to stop them." "More than a chance," Miss Marple replied, her eyes steady. "We have insight. We know the attacker is within, knows the house, knows the people, and believes they are cleverer than all of us combined. But cleverness cannot erase human behavior. Every pause, every hesitation, every fearful glance is a clue. We will watch, and we will wait, and the criminal will act again, and when they do, the trap will be ready." That night the household slept uneasily. Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting slowly, her mind tracing possible sequences. Someone within these walls was willing to escalate, to kill or harm to protect their secret. The attack on Elsie was a warning, but also a mistake. It revealed the perpetrator's impatience, their overconfidence, and their proximity. The detective's own pulse remained calm, measured, even as the threat loomed. She understood that the next hours would be critical, to watch, to note, to interpret. Whoever had removed the fragment, who had attacked Elsie, believed themselves several steps ahead, but the patient and observant eye of Miss Marple had already traced the outline of their plan, anticipating the next move before it could be made. Somewhere in the shadows of Whitmore Manor, the criminal waited, confident that the web of fear and deception had them in control. Yet Miss Marple, with the faintest smile and steady hands, knew that shadows could not remain hidden forever. The next twist would reveal more than just action. It would reveal character, motive, and ultimately the path to justice. Miss Marple spent the following morning in quiet contemplation, seated near the library window where sunlight fell across the spines of books and the polished surface of the desk. The household was subdued. Whispers passed through corridors like tentative echoes. The recent attack on Elsie had left everyone unsettled, and though the authorities were busy cataloguing movements and questioning alibis, Miss Marple observed that the tension among the household members was far more revealing than any testimony. She reviewed her notes carefully, thinking not only of what had been done, but of how it had been done. The vanished fragment, the stage linen, the wax on the Virgin, the attack on Elsie, all were threads in a single web, yet each had been seemingly unrelated until now. Her mind returned to the drawing room, to the small exercise she had conducted with the ordinary objects. The subtle reactions she had noted there, the way Mary had lingered over the porcelain figure, Edmund's nervous foot tapping, Sims's rigid control, had seemed isolated at the time, minor observations in a chaotic household. But now, in light of the attack and the missing fragment, they began to coalesce into something meaningful. She recalled one detail that had been overlooked by all but herself, the positioning of the Virgin figure on the mantelpiece. It had been slightly angled from the straight line of the other ornaments, as if nudged recently, and there was the faint smear of wax she had noticed days before. Bailey and the inspector had dismissed it as incidental, but Miss Marple had filed it away. And now, when she considered the scent of violets traced to the fragment, the knife and the pantry, she realized the figure had been both a marker and a lure. Whoever had removed the fragment had returned to that position repeatedly, perhaps to orient themselves, perhaps to convey a subtle signal. Her gaze shifted to Mary, who was quietly dusting the bookshelf nearby. The girl's hands moved methodically, yet her eyes repeatedly flicked to the corner where the Virgin figure rested. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The pattern was emerging: repetition of movement, attentiveness to small objects, careful manipulation of familiar spaces. These were not random acts. They were signatures of the criminal, the habits that gave them away despite their care. Miss Marple stood and walked slowly among the household, observing and listening. Edmund complained about the inconvenience of the ongoing investigations, but his voice betrayed a thin edge of nervousness. Sims remained poised, but seemed ever so slightly distracted, a flicker of hesitation crossing his features whenever Miss Marple's gaze lingered. Cook fussed over a tray of tea, her hands shaking as she carried it, while Elsie lingered near the door, still pale from her earlier injury. Mary moved with quiet diligence, yet there was an undercurrent of alertness in every gesture, and then she noticed it, a small envelope, barely distinguishable from the papers on the sideboard, with the edges slightly worn. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as one of the Colonel's older correspondences, previously examined but overlooked in the recent flurry of activity. The handwriting on the flap, in careful ornamental script, matched precisely the style she had noted in the Forgive, or You Shall Not Be Forgiven letter. It had been placed there by someone who wished it to remain unseen but visible enough to catch a passing eye. She held the envelope in her hand, considering. The pattern revealed itself. The criminal was meticulous, leaving traces that seemed trivial but were deliberate. The attacks, the vanished fragment, the wax, even the scented knife, all pointed to someone intimately familiar with the house and confident in their ability to manipulate attention. The movements, the small deviations from routine, the subtle signals of anxiety, they were all part of the same sequence. Miss Marple returned the envelope carefully and approached Mary. "My dear," she said softly, "the small details often hold the truth. They are the footprints of thought, the echoes of intention. It is in what seems insignificant that we find the pattern connecting everything, The fragment, the wax, the attack on Elsie, and the vanished evidence. Mary's hands trembled. I don't know what you mean. I didn't—" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not what you did, my dear, but what you have observed, what you have known. The pattern points to someone who relied on your silence, who trusted the house itself to conceal their movements. And now, because of that pattern, the truth is more visible than they imagine." She walked to the mantelpiece, resting her hand briefly on the edge of the shelf. The angle of the virgin figure, the faint wax smear, the subtle traces of scent, each a piece of a puzzle only visible when the full sequence of events was considered. It was no longer just the fragment or the attack. It was the choreography of behavior, the rhythm of human habits, that revealed the criminal's identity. Bailey, standing quietly beside her, leaned forward. "So, all along, it's been in plain sight?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Patterns are patient things. They appear not as loud proclamations, but as whispers. Those who are not attentive dismiss them. Yet to observe, to connect, to watch carefully, one sees everything, and those who think themselves cleverer than all of us combined, well, cleverness is often revealed in the smallest repetition, the smallest deviation from ordinary routine." Her gaze swept the room once more, settling on Edmund and Mary. The small gestures, the glances, the restrained movements, they all made sense in this new context. The criminal had believed the chaos, the missing fragment, and the attack on Elsie would obscure the truth. Yet every action, no matter how carefully executed, left a subtle trace, a signature, a pattern in plain sight, for the attentive eye to read. Miss Marple's knitting rested on her lap again, her needles poised. She understood now where to focus her attention, where to observe most keenly, and how to anticipate the next move. The puzzle, once scattered and chaotic, had begun to arrange itself. The seemingly insignificant details, the flicker of an eye, the subtle angle of an object, the scent lingering in the air, formed a clear trajectory. The detective allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The pattern was there, and with it the path to the final revelation. The criminal had not considered that the ordinary, the everyday, the unnoticed, these were precisely the elements that revealed the truth. The web had been spun, but in their overconfidence the perpetrator had left the thread loose, and Miss Marple, with patience and observation, was now prepared to follow it to its source. Even in the calm of the drawing-room the tension remained palpable. The household, unaware of the detective's realization, moved in subdued apprehension. Miss Marple's mind, however, traced each subtle cue, each habitual gesture, each minute clue. The pattern had emerged, and it was inexorable. The time for subtle observation was ending, the time for confrontation approached. The web of deception, carefully constructed, was beginning to unravel. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon quietly reviewing every thread of the case once more, sitting in the drawing-room while the sunlight dimmed into the soft amber of evening. The household moved about with tentative normality, each person acutely aware that the presence of a keen observer, herself, was far more dangerous than any official investigation. She had traced patterns, observed hesitation, noted glances and tremors, but now it was time to consider the why, the hidden motive that had fueled the chaos and violence. She recalled the sequence, the Colonel's death, the mysterious linen fragment, the wax and the scented knife, and finally the attack on Elsie. Each act alone might suggest a simple motivation: greed, fear, perhaps revenge. Yet the pattern revealed something more intricate. These were not isolated crimes. They were orchestrated, layered, deliberate, and the orchestration suggested a mind attuned to subtlety and secrecy, someone capable of using fear, expectation, and knowledge as tools. Her thoughts turned again to Mary, the young maid, whose hesitation over the porcelain figure had been the first real crack in the facade. Mary's nervous glances, her instinctive avoidance of certain questions, the faint traces of familiarity with the Colonel's old correspondence, all indicated that someone had drawn her into a web of knowledge, perhaps unintentionally, and that the perpetrator relied upon her discretion. Yet Mary, despite her fear, had not acted violently. No, the violence had come from someone who could manipulate not just objects, but people themselves, someone who saw the household as a stage. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she considered Edmund, whose casual arrogance had masked repeated nervous gestures, and Sims, whose rigid control suggested both loyalty and fear. And then there was the most subtle clue of all, the messages, letters, and traces left deliberately to hint, mislead, or manipulate. The motive, she realized, was not mere greed or revenge. Those motives are blunt. Instruments, easy to see. No, this was far more personal and far more psychologically intricate. Miss Marple considered the Colonel's past, his strict discipline, his long-standing insistence on propriety, and the unspoken tensions in the household. She remembered the letters, the ones carefully preserved by Mary, and the particular ornamental handwriting of the letter that had first caught her attention. Forgive, or you shall not be forgiven. Forgiveness, or lack thereof, was central. Someone had carried an old grievance forward, not simply for wealth or control, but for moral reckoning. Her mind pieced it together. The villain had not been motivated by material gain alone. They had been driven by a need to right an old wrong, one rooted not in the present but in history. An unresolved debt of conscience, or a perceived slight that had festered over decades. The Colonel's actions, his authority, his very presence, had represented judgment, discipline, and control. To the perpetrator, he embodied a moral failure, a betrayal of principle that had lingered through time. Each crime, each subtle manipulation, was an attempt to impose justice as they saw it, to reassert moral balance in a world that had once wronged them, or their family. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the mantelpiece. She examined the wax and the porcelain figure again, noting the deliberate placement. It was not merely a marker, it was symbolic, a ritualistic echo of grievance and warning. The scented knife, the linen fragment, even the attack on Elsie, all were extensions of this deeper purpose. The perpetrator had carefully constructed a narrative to ensure that each act resonated with fear, guilt, and recognition. She thought of the subtle psychological manipulation she had observed. Mary's hesitation, Edmund's twitch, Sim's rigidity. All of them had been instruments in this moral performance, and now she understood the final element. The criminal was not seeking simple concealment, they were orchestrating revelation. The disappearance of the fragment, the attacks, and the carefully placed clues were meant to test observation, patience, and discernment. They were challenging the household, the authorities, and even herself to perceive and understand the moral weight behind the actions. Bailey entered quietly, alert to her intensity. "Ma'am," he said, "you seem certain of something." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Sergeant, the motive is more subtle, more profound than we first imagined. It is not greed, nor fear, nor a simple desire for revenge. The perpetrator acts out of a sense of moral rectitude, warped though it may be, carried from the past into the present. They have been willing to kill, to threaten, to manipulate, because they believe the ends justify the means, their ends at least, and their moral ledger, and that is why they have been so careful, so meticulous, and so deliberate." Bailey frowned. "So, it's personal, but in a moral sense?" "Precisely," she said. "The criminal's psychology is defined not by wealth or power, but by the need to balance perceived injustice. And therein lies their danger. They do not see themselves as wrongdoers. They are, in their mind, correcting an error, imposing a reckoning, delivering a judgment." Her attention returned to the household, noting each reaction as members passed through the drawing-room. Edmund's arrogance, which had seemed so brazen, now appeared as a shield, a defence against exposure. Sims's loyalty revealed a fear of moral responsibility, a desire to remain honourable while complicit in silence. Mary, Elsie, and even Cook had become unwitting witnesses to the unfolding moral drama. Miss Marple reflected on the depth of the criminal's cunning. They had exploited knowledge, trust, and observation. They had weaponized the ordinary, making routine gestures, minor objects, and subtle sense serve as instruments of fear and revelation. The pattern, which had finally emerged, had not merely exposed a crime, It had illuminated the mindset behind it. And now, with this understanding, Miss Marple knew what had to be done. To confront the perpetrator, one needed more than evidence. One needed insight into their moral compass, their psychology, their sense of justice. The criminal's greatest strength, their sense of righteousness, was also their vulnerability. By demonstrating that their actions had been observed, interpreted, and understood, the detective could force a reckoning, a confrontation not of force but of conscience. Miss Marple sat again by the window, her knitting needles poised. The evening light fell softly across the manor, illuminating the faces of those she had watched so carefully. The hidden motive, the moral undercurrent that had guided each act, was now clear. The criminal was driven by a conviction deeper than greed or envy, a need to correct what they perceived as a long-standing wrong. And it was that very conviction, twisted though it was, that would allow her to draw them into the open. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The puzzle had been more intricate than she imagined, but the pieces now aligned. The final confrontation, when the hidden motive would be laid bare and justice would be served, was no longer a matter of speculation. It was imminent. The villain's psychology, once obscured behind clever manipulations and vanished evidence, was now revealed. And with its revelation, Miss Marple held the key, not only to understanding the crime, but to resolving it, and to preventing any further harm. Miss Marple moved with quiet deliberation through the manor that evening, her knitting left untouched in the drawing-room. The household had settled into an uneasy tension. The events of recent days, the Colonel's death, the vanished fragment, the attack on Elsie, had left a pall over the rooms. Every footstep echoed in corridors that seemed to hold their own breath, and every glance between household members carried the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, however, was calm. She had traced patterns, observed reactions, and understood the hidden motives that had guided the criminal. Tonight, she would orchestrate the final act. She summoned the household to the drawing-room, framing the gathering as a casual discussion rather than an accusation. Chairs were arranged in a loose circle, the fading light from the lamps softening the tension but not diminishing it. The inspector and Sergeant Bailey were present, though Miss Marple required neither of their judgments. They were witnesses to the performance she was about to conduct. "Thank you all for gathering," she began, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of attention. "The events of the past week have been most unsettling, and yet, as in all mysteries, clarity often comes from patterns that were previously overlooked. Patterns, my dear friends, are quite persistent. They appear not as loud proclamations but as quiet suggestions, waiting to be noticed by careful eyes." Mary shifted slightly, glancing at Edmund, whose jaw had tightened imperceptibly. Sims stood near the doorway, hands clasped, while Cook fussed with the hem of her apron, her face pale. Elsie remained seated, still fragile from her recent attack, yet her wide eyes held a spark of trust toward Miss Marple. "I have considered every detail, the vanished linen fragment, the porcelain figure, the wax, the subtle traces of Violet's scent, and the attack on Elsie," Miss Marple continued, moving slowly among them. Each act, each object, each hesitation revealed not only a physical trace but a pattern of intention. It was not random, it was deliberate, and it was guided by a motive that is no longer hidden. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "And it is the motive that illuminates the identity of the perpetrator." Her eyes, calm but penetrating, swept across the room, resting on Edmund for a fraction of a second before shifting to Mary. "The actions we have observed were guided not by simple greed, nor envy, nor base revenge. They were guided by the desire to impose what the perpetrator believes is moral balance, to correct a perceived injustice, one that stretches back many years, carried into the present through cunning and calculation." A faint tremor ran through Edmund's hand as he gripped the arm of his chair. Mary's fingers twisted nervously in her lap, though her gaze remained downcast. Sims's posture stiffened, while Cook's expression betrayed both apprehension and recognition. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "even the cleverest cannot conceal everything. Subtle gestures, repeated habits, and small deviations from routine reveal far more than any letter or fragment ever could. The pattern, once recognized, points to one who believed themselves entirely invisible, yet who has, by their own actions, exposed themselves completely. She paused again, letting her eyes linger on Edmund, who now shifted uncomfortably as though pulled forward by invisible threads. "Edmund, my dear," she said, her voice calm, "the fragment, the attack on Elsie, the manipulation of objects in the house. It was you who orchestrated these events, was it not?" Edmund's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise and panic flashing across his face. That's preposterous. I had nothing to do with—" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Ah, but your reactions have spoken far louder than your words. The trembling of your hands, the restless tapping of your foot, the glances you could not entirely control, all these spoke before you did. And the motive, Edmund, why you acted, reveals the truth beyond the mere acts themselves." He sank slightly in his chair, a shadow of resignation crossing his features. You don't understand. You can't understand why I had to." "But I do," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "It was not merely money or authority you sought. You were guided by the conviction of right and wrong, of balance, of rectifying a perceived injustice left unaddressed by those who ought to have intervened. And in that conviction you believed yourself justified, yet conviction does not grant immunity from consequence." The inspector cleared his throat nervously, though Miss Marple gave him a gentle look that restrained him from interruption. She continued, her voice steady and precise. "Your acts, though clever and carefully executed, were marked by human error. A slip of hesitation, a glance too long, a reaction too pronounced. The linen fragments sent, the wax on the porcelain, the attack on Elsie, all these trace your presence, and tonight, with all pieces considered, the full pattern cannot be ignored." Edmund's face paled further. I had to do it," he whispered, voice trembling. "The Colonel, he wronged our family. He punished unfairly, humiliated, and no one else would do what was necessary. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and yet the law and conscience are the measure of action, not mere intention. You acted on your perception of right, and in doing so, you crossed a line." Bailey stepped forward cautiously, hand on his notebook. "Sir, I think it's time you come with us." Edmund rose slowly, shoulders slumped, and met Miss Marple's eyes. You understood it all?" he asked, voice shaking. "I observed," she said simply, "and the pattern emerged. All of us are guided by our choices and our motives, and some leave traces more revealing than they imagine. Yours were simply more consistent than you realized." As Edmund was gently led toward the door by Bailey, he turned back once, a mixture of shame and relief in his expression. "I never meant, I only wanted, justice." "And justice," Miss Marple replied softly, "must follow the law as well as conscience. You see, Edmund, morality unchecked can become peril. Observation, patience, and careful attention have brought the truth to light before more harm could be done." The household exhaled collectively, the tension easing but the gravity of recent events lingering. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, knitting once more, calm and composed. The intricate web of deception, carefully constructed by someone clever and driven by a deep sense of personal justice, had been unravelled, not by force but by keen observation, understanding of human psychology, and the patient recognition of patterns hidden in plain sight. In the quiet that followed, the moral lesson was clear. Cleverness, even when driven by what one believes to be righteousness, cannot escape the scrutiny of a mind attuned to subtle truths. And as Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the household slowly began to restore its equilibrium, aware that the most dangerous element had been revealed and contained, and that the final reckoning had been delivered with quiet precision. The manor had settled into a fragile calm. Edmund, pale and shaken, had been taken into custody, and the household moved through the halls with measured steps, the tension of recent days gradually easing. Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting quietly, allowing the semblance of normality to take hold. Even the inspector, though still cautious, had begun to treat the case as resolved, congratulating himself and his men on their diligence. Yet Miss Marple felt a small, persistent unease. The pattern had emerged, the motive revealed, and the culprit apprehended. but something did not sit entirely right. The timing of the attacks, the meticulous staging of the vanished fragment, the subtle hints of scent and wax, they all fit Edmund's involvement, certainly. But there remained an undercurrent that suggested another mind had been at work, another hand guiding the threads from behind the scenes. She began to retrace her steps, silently reviewing the household once more. Her eyes fell upon Mary, quietly dusting the sideboard near the window. The girl had been a minor witness, timid and seemingly unconnected to the violence, yet Miss Marple remembered the slight hesitations, the repeated glances toward the mantelpiece, and the tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments she had made while no one was watching. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, but enough to register in the subtle language of observation. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the envelope she had noticed the previous day, the one with the ornamental script matching the earlier letter. It had been left unattended, yet it had not been a part of Edmund's orchestration. Who else had access, knowledge, and the capacity to subtly influence events without drawing suspicion? A noise from the staircase drew her attention, a small shuffle, barely audible but distinct in the quiet room. She turned slowly and saw Mary standing there, hands clasped, her face pale, but resolute. "Miss Marple," Mary began, her voice trembling, There's something I didn't tell anyone. I only just realized." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Yes, my dear." Mary swallowed, her eyes darting toward the mantelpiece, then to the envelope. "It wasn't just Edmund. He acted, yes, but someone guided him. Someone showed him where the fragment was, how to move it, and how to mislead everyone. I didn't understand it at first, but I noticed small signs, tiny instructions left in letters, gestures, even the placement of certain objects. It wasn't him alone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Go on, dear. Who?" Mary hesitated, then spoke, her voice low but clear. "It was Sims. He orchestrated much of it behind the scenes. Edmund followed his directions because he trusted him, or feared him, I couldn't tell. Sims had knowledge, timing and control over the household that no one suspected. He guided Edmund to commit acts, to attack, to remove the fragment, while keeping himself invisible. Everything subtle, the wax, the scent, the timing. He manipulated all of it. He is the true mastermind." Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to stretch. The revelation fit the final puzzle pieces with startling clarity. Sim's rigid control, his careful observation of all household members, his apparent loyalty and composure, all of it had masked an orchestrator who preferred to act through proxies, ensuring that suspicion fell elsewhere. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and called for the household once again. Edmund, already restrained, watched nervously, unsure of what was coming. The inspector and Bailey arrived promptly, expecting closure, while Mary remained close to Miss Marple, her hands still shaking, but eyes steady. "My friends," Miss Marple began, "we have believed this case to be resolved. Edmund, as you know, has admitted to certain acts, but confession and truth are not always synonymous. Observation, attention, and subtle understanding reveal layers beneath what is seen, and tonight a final layer emerges." Sims, standing near the doorway, shifted slightly, unaware of the scrutiny now focused entirely upon him. Miss Marple's gaze, calm but unyielding, locked on his figure. "Sims," she said softly, "you have guided events from behind a mask of loyalty and composure. You knew the location of the fragment, the timing of attacks, the psychology of each household member, and you used Edmund's sense of duty and fear to carry out acts that would otherwise draw attention to yourself. Yet even in your caution, subtle traces of pattern remain, tiny, almost invisible, yet observable to a patient and careful eye." Sims's face paled, his posture stiffening. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "Every action, every small gesture, every manipulation of objects and people, these were yours. Edmund's crimes were committed under direction, but you are the architect. The wax, the violet scent, the timing of the attack on Elsie, the careful misplacement of the fragment, all point to you. You believed yourself invisible, yet your pattern has been traced. Even the smallest detail, an envelope here, a tilt of the mantelpiece there, has betrayed you." The room grew silent, the household collectively holding its breath. Simms's eyes darted nervously toward Edmund, then to Miss Marple, and back again. I only wanted the household, protected. I guided him to prevent greater chaos," he said finally, voice tight with strain. "Protection at the cost of others' safety," Miss Marple replied gently, "is not protection at all. Fear, manipulation, and concealment may preserve appearances, but they create harm, even when intention is supposedly pure. You escalated events precisely because you believed yourself morally justified, just as Edmund acted under your influence. Yet cleverness and moral certainty cannot hide action when every gesture leaves a trace." The inspector stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, I think it's time you came with us as well." Simms's shoulders sagged, the tension breaking. I suppose I cannot deny it," he whispered. "I thought I could control everything, that no one would see. But you observed." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Observation is patient, and patterns persist, even when hidden. You relied on subtlety, yet subtlety is not invisibility, and so the truth, which cannot be wholly concealed, has emerged." The household exhaled in collective relief and astonishment. Edmund, though still in custody, now seemed less the mastermind and more a pawn in a far more intricate scheme. Mary's courage in revealing what she had seen shifted the balance entirely, highlighting the final piece that had remained hidden even from the authorities. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her knitting resumed with calm precision. Cleverness, manipulation, and perception of righteousness can be powerful, but they are not beyond scrutiny. The final revelation need not be dramatic to be decisive. It is enough that patterns, human behavior, and patient observation converge to illuminate truth. And so, the last-minute twist had reshaped everything. What had seemed a resolved case with a confessed culprit and clear motive was in fact a layered orchestration, the work of a mind that had believed itself unseen. But even the most careful design, Miss Marple knew, leaves threads that a patient, observant eye can follow to the ultimate truth. The household, though shaken, now understood the depth of the danger that had lurked so close. And Miss Marple, knitting once more by the fire, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The case was finally and fully resolved. The following morning at Whitmore Manor carried a fragile quiet. The storm that had raged the week before had passed, leaving the grounds damp but serene, the gardens gleaming with wet leaves and fresh air. Inside, the household moved cautiously, each member still processing the revelations of the previous evening. Edmund and Sims had been detained by the authorities, their confessions and admissions still sinking in. Yet despite the apparent resolution, an undercurrent of tension lingered. Not all questions had been answered, not all guilt had been reconciled, and Miss Marple knew that justice, though served, had layers beyond the obvious. She gathered the household in the drawing-room once more, this time not as an act of accusation but as a demonstration, an unveiling of the invisible threads that had bound the events together. The inspector and Sergeant Bailey watched with a mix of curiosity and professional pride, though Miss Marple's calm demeanour suggested that she had known all along what lay beneath the surface. "My friends," she began, her voice soft but commanding attention, "we have witnessed acts of violence, manipulation, and deception over the past week. 2 individuals, Edmund and Sims, have been apprehended and confessed to certain actions. And yet the truth of what occurred is subtler, more intricate, and relies not only on what was done, but on why and how it was done." She walked slowly among them, pausing to look at each face, noting the small tremors, the lingering unease, the faint glances exchanged. The Colonel's death, the vanished linen fragment, the wax on the porcelain figure, the scented knife, and the attack on Elsie. Each act carried significance beyond what was immediately apparent. And in these subtleties, we find both crime and psychology intertwined. Bailey leaned forward, notebook in hand. "Mum, are you saying that Edmund and Sims weren't acting independently?" Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly, Sergeant." Edmund, driven by fear and a sense of duty, followed instructions, believing he acted in alignment with justice. Sims, however, was the orchestrator, the subtle hand guiding events from the shadows. He manipulated timing, objects, and human behavior to conceal his role. Yet even the most careful orchestration leaves traces. She gestured toward the mantelpiece, where the slight tilt of the virgin figure, the faint wax residue, and the barely perceptible scent of violets had all been minor yet revealing clues. The clues that were most easily overlooked were the ordinary ones, Miss Marple continued. Mary noticed gestures, small adjustments, letters left in seemingly insignificant positions. These were not accidental. Sims relied on human complacency, on the assumption that routine and appearances would mask his actions. But pattern and observation do not lie. Mary, seated quietly, nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "I didn't understand it at first," she said softly. "But when I saw how he guided Edmund, I realized that the pieces I had seen weren't random." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Exactly. And it is through patient observation and attention to these seemingly trivial details that the truth emerges. The wax, the scent, the fragment, all markers of intention. The attack on Elsie, while violent, was calculated to obscure the larger orchestration, and the letters, the gestures, the minor deviations from routine, they were all threads of a pattern that has now been fully recognized." The inspector nodded, clearly impressed. "Remarkable. All of this was hiding in plain sight." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "and it demonstrates something essential. Cleverness and moral certainty, no matter how well concealed, cannot hide from observation when patterns persist. Justice, whether immediate or delayed, eventually finds a way through human error and behavior. The ordinary, when viewed with patience, reveals everything." Sims, seated quietly in the corner under the watch of the authorities, did not speak. The calm surface of his composure had cracked, leaving only a trace of defiance, mingled with the acknowledgement of exposure. He had believed himself invisible, above suspicion, yet Miss Marple's attention had traced the subtle threads of his orchestration, leaving him fully revealed. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, knitting in a slow, measured rhythm. Some may believe that justice is simply the apprehension of wrongdoers, but here we see a more nuanced reality. Patterns, gestures, and observation reveal the truth beneath appearances. Every subtle sign, every hesitant glance, every slight deviation from normalcy contributed to understanding not just who acted, but why and how the entire sequence unfolded. Bailey jotted down notes, his pen moving quickly. "So, in a way, the villain was always visible to you, even when hidden from the rest of us." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, the extraordinary often hides behind the ordinary, Sergeant, and those who act with perceived moral righteousness may not consider the ordinary consequences, the human reactions, the small habits, the residual traces of their own actions. Observation, patience, and understanding of human nature reveal the truth that eludes those focused solely on dramatic evidence." As the household absorbed her words, a sense of resolution began to settle. Edmund and Sims would face the consequences of their actions, both legal and personal, yet the insight Miss Marple provided had offered a deeper reckoning. The veil of complexity had been lifted, revealing both the mechanics of the crime and the psychology behind it. Yet, despite the resolution, there remained a subtle, lingering unease. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was such that cleverness could always re-emerge, subtlety could always disguise intent, and motives could twist in ways even a careful observer might not immediately foresee. Justice had been served, but the echoes of deception and moral ambiguity left behind a shadow, a reminder that vigilance, attention, and discernment are never truly complete. The household gradually dispersed, some to their duties, some to the gardens, and some simply to their rooms. Miss Marple stayed by the fire a moment longer, knitting calmly as sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the room in a gentle glow. She had observed, interpreted, and unveiled the truth, guiding justice to its fulfillment, while revealing the hidden layers that would have remained unnoticed to all but the most patient eye. The case at Whitmore Manor, now fully revealed, stood as a testament to the subtle power of observation, to the resilience of patterns in human behaviour, and to the quiet, inexorable reach of justice. Even when cleverness, morality, and manipulation intersected, no action was beyond scrutiny. Miss Marple, calm, composed, and ever observant, had ensured that truth prevailed, not only in law but in understanding, leaving the household both safer and enlightened, even as the faint shadows of past events lingered as a reminder that vigilance was always necessary. The knitting needles clicked softly in her hands, a rhythmic punctuation to the conclusion. The crime had been solved, the hidden motives revealed, and the perpetrators held accountable. And yet, as she observed the subtle movements of the household around her, Miss Marple knew that the smallest detail, always unnoticed, always waiting, remained a key to understanding the human heart, and that even in resolved cases there was always the possibility of new insight, new discovery, and sometimes new caution. Whitmore Manor had returned to a semblance of peace, yet the story it had told lingered, woven into the walls, the objects, and the quiet minds of those who had witnessed both the crime and its revelation. Justice had been served, carefully, patiently, and perceptively, and Miss Marple, knitting still by the fire, had once again proven that the keen eye and the patient mind are among the greatest instruments in uncovering truth. Miss Marple stepped carefully over the last patch of gravel on the garden path, her footsteps light, deliberate, the click of her shoes swallowed by the hush of the countryside. The sun had sunk low behind the hedgerows of Little Dithering, casting elongated shadows across the ivy-covered facade of Colonel Whitmore's estate. Behind her, the quiet murmurs of the police and the flickering blue of their lanterns gave way to stillness once again. The body of Sister Agnes had been taken away, the blood cleaned from the chapel's flagstones, the guests dismissed, though not without heavy protest from Lady Harrowby. And yet, as Miss Marple approached the main gate, her gloved hand pausing on the cool iron, she hesitated. There had been something not quite right. She turned her eyes back to the looming manor. The affair was wrapped, neat as could be. Colonel Whitmore's murder, cloaked in religious ritual and mistaken identities, had turned out to be a clever manipulation. Sister Agnes, who turned out not to be a nun at all but a disgraced actress named Margaret Ponsby, had orchestrated the charade to get close to the Colonel, bent on revenge for her brother, wrongly executed in Burma under Whitmore's command decades ago. The poison in the communion wine, the forged letters from a non-existent convent, the forged papal seal, it had been a performance worthy of the West End, but it had all unravelled under Miss Marple's watchful gaze, unravelling thread by thread, until the truth was laid bare in the drawing-room like a torn curtain. And yet, she let go of the gate and turned back. There was the matter of the missing rosary. It had seemed trivial at the time, a string of wooden beads taken from Sister Agnes's quarters. The police had dismissed it as a keepsake, perhaps stolen as a memento. But Miss Marple had watched Inspector Craddock search the nun's room, and she remembered clearly that he had found no rosary at all. Not until later, far too conveniently, when it had been discovered hidden behind a loose brick in the vestry. A small thing. But murders rarely hinged on the grandiose. No, in her experience it was always the minor inconsistencies that led to truth. She turned back toward the chapel. The vestry was silent now, bathed in the amber light of dusk. She stepped inside, inhaling the cold stone air. The brick in the wall had been replaced, but she reached for it again, pried it gently loose. Nothing inside, of course, but she peered closer. No dust. The other bricks in the vestry had a fine layer of age upon them, the soft, chalky patina of years untouched. But this one, wiped clean. Recently, repeatedly. Someone had hidden something here more than once. She let her eyes drift over the walls, then down to the floor. Her gaze settled on the ornate kneeler beside the altar, where the confessionals were tucked behind a faded curtain. Something tugged at the edge of her memory. The Colonel's confession, scribbled furiously on the night of his death, had been discovered in the fire grate of his study. But had he truly burned all of it? She approached the confessional. The curtain was heavy, the kind of thick velvet that swallowed sound. She drew it aside and stepped in. There was something lodged in the corner of the seat. She reached down with careful fingers and pulled out a folded slip of paper, edges charred slightly, as though someone had tried to destroy it but stopped short. Opening it, she read the words slowly, mouth tightening. She said her name was Margaret, but she lied. I remember her now, not from the theatre, from Rangoon. She wore a habit then, too. Miss Marple's breath caught. He'd known. The Colonel had recognised her, not as an actress, not even as the sister of the executed man, but from Burma. She had worn the habit before, not for disguise, but for devotion. So Sister Agnes hadn't merely played a nun. She had once been one. Why had she left? Why had she returned in disguise? And why had she killed him only after he remembered her? There was something deeper here. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to see Reverend Milton entering, his expression drawn. "I thought everyone had left," he said softly. "As did I," she replied, folding the note discreetly into her handbag. "But some things are better uncovered in solitude." His eyes flickered toward the confessional, but he said nothing. She stepped past him, pausing only briefly. "Tell me, Reverend, how long had Sister Agnes been corresponding with you before she arrived?" His lips parted, but no answer came. "I ask," she continued gently, "because she claimed to have been invited to serve at the chapel, and yet there's no letter from you, no record in your calendar, and no other nuns from her convent ever contacted you." Reverend Milton looked down. "I didn't think it important. She seemed sincere. God sends help in mysterious ways, does he not?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So, he does. And sometimes vengeance wears a saintly smile." He stiffened at that, but said nothing more. Outside, the sun had dipped fully beneath the trees, and the garden lay in quiet darkness. As she reached her waiting car, Miss Marple paused, fingers brushing her reticule thoughtfully. The note in her bag told a more complicated story. Margaret Ponsby had not merely sought revenge for her brother. She had sought to punish a man who had once broken more than just military code. The look on her face when she was arrested had not been satisfaction. It had been sorrow, a sorrow deeper than theatrical betrayal. Miss Marple sat in the back seat, the road home stretching ahead, but her thoughts trailing behind. Perhaps one day the rest of the story would surface. A buried affair in Burma, a nun cast out for sins never confessed, a colonel's guilt rooted in something more intimate than duty. The case, officially, was closed. But mysteries, in Miss Marple's experience, rarely ended so cleanly. There was always another thread waiting to be pulled.